All right, good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started. Resend out that link, so apologize for that, but it's the correct one is in the calendar invite. So we'll get started with the session. We have a lot of information to share today and presenters. We will take questions, but we're going to have them at the end of the session like we normally do. But if you don't want to forget your question, go ahead and put them in the chat box. We have two individuals behind the scenes, Krista and Dave, that will be answering questions as they come in. But we're going to take the verbal questions and majority of them after the session. With that, we'll get started and we'll hand it over to Grant Beebe. Go ahead, Grant.
Hey, thanks, Jennifer. And just to note that we've got some of our peers from the solicitor's office are on hand today, knowing that we're going to talk about a couple things that kind of walk that line into the kinds of things that we asked for solicitor help on. We had this plan to talk about the resumption of prescribed fire in the Forest Service and to talk about the implications to our program, maybe some improvements or adjustments we might want to make in our program based on what they had found out about theirs. We want to acknowledge that, Forest Service lost a number of prescribed fires this year, some of them really catastrophic. We in the BLM lost one, to our knowledge, as well, and nobody, no land manager, is immune from losing prescribed fires. Is kind of part of the business, as we all know. You're going to light them, you're going to lose them. That's what happens. I think the events in Eastern Oregon just took things up a notch for all of us. The message I posted in the chat came out this week from Tracy Stone Manning and Mike Ned, in support of all of us who are working in the program, and especially you out there who are actually putting fire on the ground. And it mirrors what the Forest Service rightfully said to their employees as well. We got a big job, we got a hard job, and it requires taking some risks, and we mitigate those risks, and we stand behind our employees. And so I think our headquarters office was horrified by what happened in Eastern Oregon. Yet I think all of us kind of understand the context as well. Everybody who manages public lands in the West and in the other parts of the country as well, know that dealing with our partners is one of the most important pieces of the job. Bringing our partners along, making sure we're talking to them, making sure we're all in agreement about what needs to happen when we can be, and at least let folks know how we're going about our business is really key. And so all of you who are working out there on this program know that that's part of the job is talking to the folks who live and work near us on those lands. But unequivocally, BLM management is behind the program, behind those folks who are doing this really difficult job, and supporting you when you make those difficult decisions. So we want to make sure that we put that right out there, right up front, that's the stance of the Bureau, and we've got your back. So Jennifer, I think that's all I have to say right now. Thanks.
Thanks, Grant. I appreciate that. And with that, we're going to send it to Jolie. Go ahead, Jolie.
Hi, thanks, Grant. I appreciate you sharing those leadership remarks and leadership support for the Prescribed Fire Program. I want to welcome everyone to the webinar. And we talked about when would be a good time to do this webinar, and we chose this time because this last month the Forest Service released a report that followed their 90-day pause. And so I'll back up a tiny bit to remind people about the events that occurred this year. In April, the Forest Service lost a couple of prescribed fires. They escaped their containment lines. They were pretty significant, and the Forest Service then instituted a 90-day pause on prescribed fire while they reviewed those incidents and came up with a plan to review what had happened and then how they might be able to strengthen the program for the future. In September, the Forest Service developed their National Prescribed Fire Program review, and with that, they identified a series of action items that they would be taking to hopefully minimize impacts from these kinds of events in the future. And we're here today to kind of talk about some of the key items in that report, especially how those items would interface with the interagency community and BLM specifically. And also Angie and Pat are going to share with us just a little bit of history on the, BLM had already experienced a a very significant and high-profile prescribed fire escape in 1999, and out of that, we had quite a few actions that we took to strengthen our program. So they'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll open it up to questions. So with that, I think I will pass it on to Pat Hardy. Pat is the fuel specialist for Montana for the BLM. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, okay, good afternoon, folks. Pat Hardy. Just wanted to briefly go over our RX treatments and accomplishments today over the last 10 years. You can see, kind of looking at the slide there, over the last 10 years, the BLM has averaged a little over 260 prescribed fire treatments annually, and for about an average of 115,000 acres. Very comparable to the rest of the DOI agencies. Over that time frame, DOI wide averages about 140K a year. So we're all kind of in that ballpark. Over that time frame, the Forest Service, they averaged about 4,500 prescribed fire treatments for about 2 million acres. So a little bit larger program than DOI's. Given the 90-day pause from the Forest Service and their program review, we thought it'd be worthwhile to take a look at BLM declared wildfires. Over the last 10 years, we've had 6 declared wildfires, 2 of which warranted national review and 4 state level reviews. And with that said, just a brief review of what constitutes a declared wildfire. So a declared wildfire must be declared by those identified in the burn plan when the following criteria are met. So if prescription parameters are exceeded and holding and contingency actions cannot secure the fire by the end of the next burning period, or the fire has spread outside the project area or is likely to do so, and contingency actions have failed, and the fire cannot be contained by the end of the next burning period. That's the policy answer. Also, prescribed fire can be declared a wildfire for reasons other than those identified above if events cannot be mitigated as determined by the burn boss or the agency administrator. So could be things such as smoke impacts, etc. So I think one takeaway is that there's no harm or shame in declaring a wildfire if events dictate that. What constitutes a national review? We're required to do a national review on all prescribed fires that result in a fatality, injuries to people that aren't part of the operation, a shelter deployment, major transportation route closures, smoke violations for a major population center, or where suppression expenditures or damages to property exceed $250,000. State level reviews can be requested at any time for any prescribed fire. And if you have expenditures or property damages less than $250,000. So with that said, in the last 5 years, like I said, from BLM has had 4 declared wildfires, 1 national and 3 state reviews. And over the last 10 years, roughly 2% of BLM prescribed fires have resulted in declared wildfire. So very successful program, mature program that has positive results the vast majority of the time. And with that, I will hand it over to Angie for further discussion on BLM prescribed fire policy.
Okay, thanks, Pat. So we just wanted to go over a quick overview of what is the BLM prescribed fire policy and where you can find it. So first document we have listed there is the NWCG Standards for Prescribed Fire Planning and Implementation. And this document establishes the national interagency standard for prescribed fire. So basically what is minimally acceptable for the agencies. It also, we can be more, and Chris is going to drop the links into all these documents as I talk to him. So within that, BLM or agencies could accept or choose to be more restrictive, and within BLM, a state or a unit can be more restrictive. BLM also follows the minimum standards for the RX plan template in the complexity analysis. The next one, the Red Book, there is some prescribed fire policy within the Red Book, but a lot of that, when it's broken down to agency policy, it'll refer BLM people back to our BLM manual and handbook. And like Jolie said, there's an additional requirements above and beyond that PMS 484, and it's within our fuels management and community assistant manual and handbook. So out of the Loudon Ranch National BLM Prescribed Fire Review back in '99, BLM has added 18 additional BLM requirements for prescribed fire. And it's anything from adding additional signatures on burn plans, additional details within the burn plan elements, to approvals for and then also approvals for conducting prescribed fires during preparedness levels 4 and 5. The manual, it covers all the fuels management program responsibilities by position, all the way from the national assistant director level down to the district or field office fuels specialist. Next slide, please. And then after policy, there's prescribed fire qualifications. And again, NWCG standards for wildland fire position qualifications, everyone knows that as PMS 310-1, sets the minimum standards for position qualifications for training, experience, physical fitness, and currency. There's also a federal wildland fire qualification supplement, and it's agency endorsed positions that aren't in the PMS 301 or 310, and they're NWCG agency specific task books. So in the section under prescribed fire, that's where BLM can find the RXB3 position and the TerraTorch operator. Then going down to just BLM additional requirements that are above and beyond that 310-1 for experience, training, and fitness levels. Those are found in the BLM standards for fire training and workforce development. So in RX, in prescribed fire, we have additional qualifications for the Burn Boss Type 1. They also need to have satisfactory performance as an IC Type 3. We have additional training requirements for the Burn Boss Type 2 and the Firing Boss. And then finally, BLM has different physical fitness standards. So we require Arduous for our firing bosses and our FEMOs. Next slide. So this is a slide of all of what is, the first column is what the policy is, what the minimum standard interagency is, kind of some of the BLM additional requirements, and now the Forest Service added additional requirements. So there's a lot of detail that's the Forest Service added into their requirements that's already found within an element description or back into the prescribed fire guide. So I just wanted to focus on those things that are different and that Forest Service is requiring and BLM's not. So those are the highlighted ones, and there's just 4 that are completely different. So let's go to the first one. It's the policy requiring agency administrators to conduct site visits on prescribed burns. So BLM does have an additional requirement that we require line officers and agency administrators to personally visit 1 prescribed fire annually on their unit. If you go over to the Forest Service, nationally, they are saying the Forest Service agency administrators will be present on the Forest Service unit while all high complexity prescribed fires are happening. Unit line officers will be present on the Forest Service unit 30 to 40% of the time they're conducting moderate complexity fires. So basically that means they'll be in the office. Additionally, agency administrators and line officers will visit the fire line on all high complexity burns to observe firing operations and fire behavior. And then it's suggested that new agency administrators would benefit spending additional time on the fire line, observing fire behavior with prescribed fire personnel. The second highlighted one is the element 2A, the ignition authorization. So BLM just does the national standard and the template. Forest Service has come up with their own prescribed fire template, and they've added a few sentences. So they actually add a sentence that says, requires them to indicate the drought metrics and the drought awareness, and then either sign if it's worsening, improving, or stable. So they need to identify where the drought awareness is. They did add a signature line. And then finally, this is the biggest thing, is that their authorizations they sign are only good for a 24-hour period. BLM, we still allow the agency managers to assign a period that they're comfortable with. So that's the difference. Next slide. So on element 3 on the complexity analysis, BLM, we're just going to use the same NWCG complexity analysis and worksheet. Forest Service is making AAs be briefed and documented on that preliminary risk rating, the one prior the worksheet. If you notice, it's on a drop-down menu. It's a yes or no question. It's optional. Forest Service is just making that mandatory, that they have to be involved with the preliminary risk rating. Next slide. And finally, the last difference between the two agencies is the contingency planning in element 17. BLM and national or minimum standards is that you're going to have an MAP table, actions needed identified, and the minimum contingency resources needed and response time. BLM is also going to put that within their prescribed fire project file. And then Forest Service is requiring that all their contingency resources for moderate to high complexity burns will ensure a 30-minute minimum maximum response time. So all of their contingencies have to be 30 minutes.
All right, thanks Angie and Pat for that presentation. Like Grant said, we have two solicitors with us today to answer any of those questions. We have Mel Meyer and Hanina Levine as well from the solicitor's office to address any questions. So with that, I'm going to pull up the chat box where folks I know have been putting in some questions and kind of get those answered, and we'll start out. All right, well, while we're looking at that, we'll go ahead with Michael. Michael, go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, you got me?
Yep, I got you.
Hey, this is Michael Alberton. I'm a fuel specialist at the Missoula field office. Run the fuels program here, Prescribed Fire Burn Boss. We do lots of prescribed burning. Couple questions out of that report, something that I've been thinking about for a while. It says Prescribed Fire Program has institutional limitations on implementation, support, and funding that wildland fire suppression does not. Fire suppression tools, resources, and expertise are not being sufficiently used by prescribed fire practitioners because of perceived and real administrative and procedural barriers. I also go out as ops section chief on an incident management team. And so I see quite a few limitations that we have on the prescribed fire that we don't have on the wildfire. So I'm just wondering, as the Forest Service and hopefully DOI start implementing some of the recommendations from the review, could anybody maybe talk about what we're doing to make prescribed fire look a little bit more like wildfire, particularly with ordering of resources, and then paying of those resources, maybe something like a P number. And then also in the grants and agreements world, they also touch on that in the report. So this fall, when I did some prescribed burning, I had resources from TNC, Forest Service, BLM, Confederated Sailors Kootenai Tribe, DNRC, Missoula Rural Fire Department, and every single one of those I had to have an agreement with. And if Spokane's doing the same type of burning, they also have to have the same agreements with the same entities. If we have a wildfire in the same location, we don't have to have any of those agreements. It works very well. So those are just some of the barriers that I struggle with. And I'm hoping that, you know, unfortunately we had some escapes here down in New Mexico, but I'm hoping that some of these things that are in the report could kind of help us all. Sorry, that was a little long-winded.
No, that's okay. Thanks for that. Angie or Pat?
Yeah, I can start. You know, that Forest Service report had 3 specific areas of actions. One was those 7 that were immediately, and then there was 9 actions to be considered for near-term implementation to improve the program. And then there was 36 recommendations to be considered for deeper, longer-term study. I know I sit on the NWCG Fuels Management Committee, and I know that that is one of the things that we have been talking about. And that's the interagency involvement. So we are trying to work on a prescribed fire agreement nationally so we can move these resources around. I think there's some other suggestions out of that report that haven't been implemented or even started working on yet. So hopefully that answers your question. I think the interagency community is going to try to help out the Forest Service. We just haven't been tasked officially with that yet.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I just think if we really want to increase pace and scale, while prescribed fire needs to look a lot like wildfire. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Michael. Next question we have is, can we get a copy of the crosswalk?
Yes, James, I will drop that in the link.
I'll add a couple things that that we wanted to leave a lot of room for questions, but since there's not we're not being inundated with questions, I'll just point out that in the Forest Service National Prescribed Fire Program review, yeah, out of that there was the pause, and it has been very clear that upon the resuming of the Prescribed Fire Program with the Forest Service, that if their resources are not otherwise committed, they are available to help the BLM with our prescribed fire activities. And so there was a little bit of a pause on that for a while. And now that typical relationship has resumed, where we are able to work with the Forest Service and possibly utilize their resources to support BLM prescribed burning. So that was, we were really happy to hear about that change.
All right, thanks, Jolie. We have a question from Leroy. Does the BLM RX burn boss have to follow the Forest Service policy if they burn on Forest Service? Angie, is that Angie or Pat?
Yes, they would have to, because it's on Forest Service land.
Thank you. Next one, with a recent incident in Oregon, was there any implications or charges brought against agency administrator that signed off on the plan and implementation?
I can take a stab at that. I guess I would say that I don't think so, but I only know what I've seen reported in the news, but I don't think so.
All right, next question, any discussion on applying hazard duty pay for RX burns? Angie or Pat, do you have anything on that?
I have not heard anything in the NWCG FMC level on that.
I'll just add a little bit more about the interagency involvement, kind of following the release of this Forest Service National Prescribed Fire Program review, they did identify quite a few training related activities, and a lot of those would involve the interagency community. And so BLM is working with the Forest Service and our interagency federal partners to explore, to move forward some of those training initiatives in an interagency basis. And so there's probably there will be more work to do associated with that. And that was already something that we had been discussing and talking about, especially with the expansion of the funding to support fuels management work and prescribed fire with the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law. So those conversations are ongoing, and BLM is working with the Forest Service and the other interagency partners to enhance fuels management training, including prescribed fire training. So that's something that we expect to see some movement on in the next year or so.
Thanks, Jolie. Any follow-up from any of our speakers or presenters today that we want to add anything to highlight?
Hey, Jennifer, I got a couple things. One, I'll say to hazard pay, obviously the argument against hazard pay and prescribed fires is that these are planned events and controlled burns, hence the name controlled burns. And so hazard doesn't go along with something you control theoretically, right? So that's the traditional argument against hazard pay. I think one of the evolving things on hazard pay for prescribed fires is really smoke exposure and whether that should be, by itself an association with hazard pay. But there is talk about that. It comes up, especially in groups like Grassroots Fire. But the argument against it is that whole planned event thing. To the thought of treating prescribed fire like wildfire, just a couple for context. One, fixed dollars versus essentially unfixed. So suppression, we have a cap adjustment, and when we run out of suppression funds, obviously we go beyond because the nation realizes we need to respond to fire. So the point is, should the nation be considering prescribed fire work like suppression, like something we absolutely need to do regardless of how much we spend on it? That would be the theoretical argument in favor of doing that kind of thing. People haven't gotten there yet. I'll say that OMB, the kind of people who are really paying attention to what we do on the fuel side of things, especially, want to make sure that the dollars we spend equal dollars in risk reduction. And so we're still having those kinds of conversations with budget folks about the value of doing fuels management work and the benefit to the landscape on the tail end. So I think we have some hurdles first before we get into kind of this big pooled funding, similar to suppression. And of course, what people say about suppression is that it's a blank check, and there are no controls on suppression. So we're always making that argument that we do have controls there. But I think there's definitely a move among all the agencies to be to spend a little freer and to not be so focused on the bottom line and to make resources more available. I'll say, as we work on our workforce and recognizing that a lot of the work we're doing in fuels is shoulder season work, I think one thing to guard against is having people travel so much in the shoulder seasons that they're traveling all summer, all spring, and all fall in roving pods, and we really affect people's quality of life. So I think we want to guard against being too focused on traveling folks long distances without really thinking about what we're asking them to do in their personal lives as well. So I think that's one thing to guard against, is that we don't expect people to travel 9 months instead of 4 or 5 months. That's something just to be careful on. Not that it's not a good concept, that we should do more roving and have people be able to move around a little more freely, especially not worrying about the bottom line. And then, I guess that's it, Jennifer. Just a couple observations, but definitely people want to get around some of those administrative burdens for using partners, more national level agreements, so people can move a little bit more. And obviously, we've done all this stuff in the past where we've pooled funds and traveled people without worrying about where the money was coming from, and that works until people like Congress then start restricting our budgets and saying, no, we're gonna cut your budget in half. So it kind of does this pendulum swing thing. it does feel like the nation's in a different place now, and that there is more support for bigger investments in fuels management, and we're trying to keep that going, keep the momentum, and have people recognize that we have to make these investments, otherwise we're never going to catch up. Thanks.
Thanks, Grant. This one actually might be for you. As a burn boss, if I have to declare a prescribed fire as a wildfire, what does support from the BLM look like? Is there a process in place for that?
I missed that word, support. What?
If a burn boss has to declare a wildfire or prescribed fire as a wildfire, what does support from BLM look like? Is there a process in place for that?
So I'll use the example from this summer, or when was it? Was it late spring? It was probably before summer. So from New Mexico, those folks were burning, broadcast burning. Burn got outside of their control lines in some tamarisk. They quickly ordered some very expensive suppression resources based on the resources at risk nearby. I believe it was VLAD actually that they ended up launching. Quickly realized we were going to spend more than $250,000, and the very first thing we did from the national level on down was commend them for declaring an escape, saying absolutely, you made absolutely the right call, which was declare an escape, get the resources you need, make sure that you don't end up having an impact on your partners. So I guess that's what national level support looks like to me. It's like rather than chastising them for losing a burn, it was congratulating them for recognizing that they needed some additional help and going to get that additional help, and that made it into the final report as well. And I think there has not been a time when we've been talking either to New Mexico or to the headquarters staff about that prescribed fire that got away, where we haven't made note of that right up front, that that these folks, despite what looks like an embarrassing situation to declare a wildfire, they made absolutely the right call, and that fires do escape, and we try to prevent it, and we try to do better next time when we go down and look at the situation down there, before they lit the match. But I think in BLM, that's what it absolutely looks like, is congratulating people for making the right call and not blaming them for that, if that helps.
Thank you, Grant. Next one, we have a question on, is there any discussion on streamlining the process to cross-bill Forest Service and BLM project monies that there doesn't require a one-time MOU work agreement to pay U.S. Forest Service personnel working on BLM projects?
Again, this is Angie. We don't have that set up yet. We have been talking interagency about we have a UAS agreement with the Forest Service, and how could we take that, expand on it to not only cover this scenario, but cash dispatchers that are Forest Service when you're dispatching BLM resources to a fire. So hopefully trying to cover all of the things that would support the prescribed fire program, but no, it's just now being worked on.
All right, thanks, Angie. It looks like we have two liability questions. Paul kind of gave sorry, trying to get through many things. Paul Hone gave a Red Book guidance on chapter 10, but there's a question from Carrie Bilbao. What about personal liability? How does the agency plan to support employees if they are sued personally for an escape burn? Would one of our solicitors like to address that for the group, please?
Yeah, I'll take a first stab at that. There is a process in place where DOI can work with the Department of Justice to get representation for an employee that is sued in their personal capacity. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into that. It has to have some kind of preliminary and determination that the employee was working within the scope of their duties. But we do have a process for that, and well, we can't really comment on the case in Oregon, but we expect that that's what will happen, is that DOJ will represent that individual. I'll touch just quickly on professional liability insurance. I saw that P. Hone already put that in the chat. BLM does have an instruction memorandum It's 2008-115. So in addition to the Red Book and that secretarial bulletin, BLM also has an IM for reimbursement purposes. Really, we can't advise on whether people should get professional liability insurance or not. That's something that's really a personal decision, but we can certainly point you to those policy documents so you can review the information and have a conversation with your supervisor on it. But it is something that's available to you. It probably would be most helpful just in the interim where we're working through that process to see if DOJ will represent you personally. So I think that interim period can be pretty uncertain and maybe even a little overwhelming. So professional liability insurance is something that can really fill in that gap period. If for some reason the Department of Interior or Justice determines that for whatever reason it's not appropriate to represent you in your personal capacity, then obviously that professional liability insurance would be really helpful. So it's definitely something to consider. We do a lot of talk about liability with fire, and really, without going into too much detail, there is the Federal Tort Claims Act, and as long as you're working within the scope of your duties, you're generally protected under that law. The other thing that I would just throw out pretty quickly is it really is rare that we see people charged in their individual capacity. And the biggest reason for that is on a lot of the civil matters, individuals or entities are looking for monetary damages. And obviously the federal government's probably going to have more funding opportunities than an individual. So generally when we see escape burns or any kind of tort where, that arises from employees working within the scope of their duty, we're most usually going to see that claim come through to the federal government versus somebody in their individual capacity. But every now and then it does happen. And, I think we're all watching that case in Oregon pretty closely to see how it all plays out. Anina, did you have anything you want to maybe add in on that?
No, I think that, you covered it really well, Mel. I'll just say there are obviously, both new questions that are coming up and maybe questions that are not new, but kind of have new urgency for folks. I think, we can discuss after the call, maybe with, some of the organizers, kind of what's a good way to collect legal questions if they come up from, from folks at the solicitor's office. Can give advice and be giving kind of consistent advice and advice that you all can use. So I think I think you guys as a professional community have a good opportunity to kind of pull together what questions are burning for you guys, and then send them over to us so that we can we can be tackling the questions that are really, really important to you guys if Mel has not already answered everything that was on your minds.
Hey, could you two talk about the criminal charges, the misdemeanor charges? Is that different from civil liability in this case? Same thing, acted within scope of your employment? Any thoughts?
So it is different in that kind of the specific laws involved are different. On the civil side, kind of the main law involved here is the Federal Tort Claims Act, which is the same law under which, someone could sue the United States. That has provisions that also say that if someone sues a federal employee and the employee was acting within their, within the scope of their employment, then the United States can kind of step in. On the criminal side, it's a different set of laws. on a big picture, the idea is kind of similar, which is that if you're acting within the scope of your employment, you know, the United States ultimately, in terms of the end result, can bail you out. But it's also similar in that, like Mel said, there's a lot of hoops to jump through. You know, and that doesn't mean that, you know, from day one, you know, you never have to worry about a thing, because, you know, you'll be lifted along on, you know, DOJ will swoop in and, you know, rescue you from any danger, you know, that, and I don't mean to be glib, you know, I really don't mean to be glib, you know, I'm kind of recognizing and acknowledging the anxiety that I hear. You know, there can be anxious times along the way, even if the outcome, you know, should be fine in the long run. So they're kind of analogous in that in both cases, you know, in the long run, the United States and DOJ should, you know, should be able to help employees out, but in the short term, there can be some anxious times. I don't know, you know, Grant, I don't know how much farther you want me to go into detail on that. I think, you know, we're not really prepared today with a full briefing on all the steps and the timelines and everything. We can circle back on that, you know, in the future if that's a priority.
I think it is actually. So we definitely, I think, need to. This is probably a new scenario for some folks to be thinking about. Like, you know, I was acting within the scope of my employment. I was following a good burn plan, and this ties back to how we started, which is having a good burn plan, following the burn plan, and it still goes wrong, still goes bad, and something bad happens. I think we would all expect that our employers would be 100% behind us and sending a lawyer, you know, sending an attorney to help us, and we would be bailed out by our bosses. So I'm hoping that's the answer, and I think it is. But I guess that's the kind of thing I if I were still lighting burns, which I'm not, I'd want to hear from my employers.
Sure, and you know, we can pull together. Part of the truth is, you know, some of the expertise on these questions is scattered through different parts of the solicitor's office. None of these questions are totally new to the solicitor's office as a whole, but you know, we kind of want to go back and pull together the expertise from, you know, from different people so we can really give a good presentation. I think, you know, again, the top level answer I'd give is, as you say, you know, if you're acting within scope of your employment and consistent within policies, you know, ultimately the United States, you know, does have laws that, you know, put it in a position to stand behind its employees. But, you know, again, that, you know, that doesn't always mean that, you know, from, you know, hour number one on day one, you know, you've got a DOJ lawyer with you right there.
Right. I mean, I guess we should also put this in context. I could be driving a government rig, for instance, and if I'm speeding down the highway and I, you know, am involved in an accident, then there is some personal liability on my part because I have not been, you know, using due diligence. Sorry, I'm not going to try to sound lawyerly, but we have responsibilities as employees to obey laws and you know, follow policies on top of it. So it feels like that should be the same expectation in prescribed fire or fire suppression, that we do the best we can within policy, but if we act recklessly and carelessly, there are limits to what the government will do to back us up. Something like that, I think, is where my brain goes.
So we'll kind of, you know, we'll take this back to, you know, the SOL Brain Trust, and we'll try to put together a presentation kind of pulling on the expertise of everyone, you know, within SOL who knows about the civil side and the criminal side. You know, we'll try to put something together.
All right, thanks, Mel. Thank you guys for that. Appreciate it. And yeah, I'll work with you guys on gathering some stuff, and also I've written down the IMs, but I'll go with you so we can follow that up on our FAQs as well as follow-up emails. I see that Dave and Angie are answering questions in the chat box, so appreciate that, you guys. With that, if there are no other questions, I'm looking to make sure. Any discussion on operational quals experience that will maintain RXB currency? Is one. Angie, is that something you can?
We've had those discussions in the past for IC and division, and not all the agencies or even states for BLM agreed on that. So that was a tasking that didn't go through. So I'm sure that it'll be possibly brought up again in some of the new those additional requirements for longer term. So we'll see if that gets brought up again.
Great, thanks, Angie. And we did have an in-depth conversation or presentation about liability insurance for RX Fire to provide to Burn Boss would be great. So we'll work with the solicitor's office to get information and get that sent out to folks. All right, I see no other questions in the chat box or hand raised. So with that, we're going to close out today's session. Thanks everyone for joining the session today. Thank you so much for the presenters, for our guest speakers, as well as answering those questions. And we'll get that information out to you guys next week. We'll get the recording situated and get that done and prepped, and as well as the FAQs, we'll get information added on some of the commonly asked questions that you guys have worked with today. With that, our next session for Fire Chat Friday is scheduled for next Friday, November 4th. We'll have folks from NWCG talking about the incident performance and training modernization. That is next Friday at noon. More information will be coming out with that. Have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy the fall weather, and we'll talk to you next week. Thank you.